The dust of the saloon floor tasted like despair and stale beer. Eleanor clung to the small, bundled form of her son, barely a month old, his fragile weight a terrifying anchor in the maelstrom of her humiliation. Faces swam before her. Blurred by tears, she refused to let fall course. Leering, calculating faces illuminated by the smoky lamplight. She stood on a makeshift platform, the rough wood digging into her worn soles, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. "Look at boys," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice raw and booming over the murmurs of the crowd. He was a fleshy man, slick with sweat, pointing a thick finger first at Eleanor, then at the infant clutched against her breast. "Used goods. Jilted and left with the consequences." Her fine groom rode off faster than a jackrabbit from a coyote, but young and strong, and a healthy babe. Plenty of work in these parts for a woman who ain't afraid to earn her keep, and a child. Well, a child grows into hands, don't he? Laughter rippled through the room, cruel and knowing. Eleanor flinched, pulling her son tighter, pressing her face into the soft wool of his blanket, inhaling his clean, milky scent, the only pure thing in this degraded space. Shame was a physical weight, crushing her chest, stealing her breath. She had been so naive, believing his promises, following him west only to be abandoned when her condition became apparent. Now this, reduced to property, her future and her son's fate to be decided by the highest bidder in this den of iniquity. A man in the crowd spat on the floor. "What's the starting bid on damaged goods?" he sneered. Another called out, 50 cents. She looks like she'd break easy. $1. A woman with a babe means she ain't barren. A voice countered from the back. The auctioneer grinned, rubbing his hands. $1 we have. Do I hear two? $2 for the woman and her whelp. Come now, think of the possibilities. A cook, a cleaner. His gaze lingered on her in a way that turned her stomach. Companion for those long, cold nights. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer forming on her lips, not for rescue. She had long given up on such fantasies, but for strength to face whatever horror awaited her, to protect her son until her last breath. The bidding rose, slow but steady, each call a hammer blow against her dignity. $5, 6, 8. The price of a beast of burden or less. Suddenly, the saloon doors burst open, letting in a blast of cold night air and a moment of stunned silence. Standing silhouetted against the less harsh light outside was a man. Tall, lean, draped in a long duster, a low-brimmed hat shadowing his face. His presence commanded attention, quiet yet potent. The auctioneer paused, annoyed by the interruption. "State your business, stranger. We're in the middle of something here." The stranger didn't speak. His hand, quick as a striking snake, went to the low-slung gun belt at his hip. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. A single shot, clean and precise, tearing through the rope that held the auctioneer's gavel suspended above his head. The gavel splintered, harmless pieces raining down. Then, the stranger's voice, low and gravelly, cut through the shocked silence. "Auction's over." Chaos erupted. Men scattered, shouting, overturning tables. The auctioneer, pale and sputtering, retreated. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wide, the baby stirring in her arms. The stranger hadn't looked at her, his gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge him. He was a storm that had just passed through, leaving wreckage and silence in its wake. She didn't know who he was or why he had intervened, but for the first time in weeks, a sliver of something other than despair pierced the gloom. Sheer, unadulterated fear of the unknown. The dust settled slowly, coating the wreckage of the saloon floor. The men who hadn't fled outright hovered near the walls, eyes fixed on the stranger who now stood, silent and unmoving, near the splintered remnants of the auction block. Eleanor remained on the platform, trembling, the baby beginning to whimper softly. The stranger finally turned his head, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. His eyes, shadowed by the hat brim, were unreadable, neither kind nor cruel, simply assessing. She couldn't discern his purpose, only the stark reality that her precarious situation had traded one threat for another. He spoke, his voice still low, devoid of inflection. "Get down." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Eleanor hesitated for only a fraction of a second, her limbs stiff with shock and fear. Then, driven by instinct and the need to escape the gawking eyes of the men, she carefully stepped down from the platform, her knees weak. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the scuffed floorboards, acutely aware of his presence just a few feet away. The baby's whimper intensified, a small, distressed cry that seemed to amplify the silence in the room. The stranger moved towards the doors, then paused, glancing back. "You coming?" Again, the blunt, unadorned question. Eleanor looked up, confused. Where would she go? With him? Into the night? The saloon, for all its horrors, was at least shelter from the biting wind that now swept through the open doorway. But staying here, she knew, was no longer an option. The men who had bid on her would not forget, and the auctioneer's anger would be swift and brutal. She had nowhere else. Her meager belongings, packed in a small satchel, sat near the ruined platform. Without a word, she walked to it, scooped it up, and gripping her son tightly, moved towards the doors, towards the stranger, towards the unknown. He held the door open, stepping aside to let her pass. As she went through, the cold air hit her face, sharp and bracing. The town was quiet now, only the wind whistling around corners and the distant sound of a dog barking. He followed her out, letting the doors swing shut behind them, plunging the saloon back into a more subdued dimness. They walked in silence. Eleanor didn't know where they were going, didn't dare ask. The stranger walked slightly ahead, setting a steady pace, his long strides eating up the ground. She focused on keeping up, on protecting the baby from the biting wind, on the rhythm of her own breathing. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a fragile, bewildered hope began to stir. He hadn't hurt her. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply stopped the auction. Why? He led her away from the town, towards the dark shapes of the hills looming against the starlit sky. The ground grew rougher underfoot, turning to frozen earth and scattered rocks. The baby finally settled, snuffling softly against her chest. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of their strange, sudden connection born of violence and intervention. She studied his back, the way he moved, economical, alert. He wasn't just a man. He was clearly capable, maybe dangerous. But his danger, she sensed, was directed outward, not inward. She had known men whose danger was a coiled viper within, striking at those closest. This felt different. After what seemed like a long time, he stopped near a cluster of rocks that offered a small windbreak. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. He knelt, pulling out a small shovel from a pack slung over his shoulder, and began clearing a patch of ground. Then quickly built a small, efficient fire from dry brush. He seemed to know where to find even in the dark. The flames licked upwards, casting dancing shadows, pushing back the cold and the oppressive darkness. Eleanor sank to the ground near the fire, huddling her son closer, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her. He had offered no explanation, made no demands. He had simply provided warmth. It was the first simple kindness she had been shown in a long, long time. The fire crackled, a small beacon of warmth in the vast, indifferent landscape. Eleanor watched the stranger as he moved with quiet efficiency, checking their surroundings, adding more wood to the fire. He didn't speak, didn't intrude, simply existed beside her in the shared space of their temporary refuge. She was still afraid, the fear of the unknown a constant hum beneath her skin, but it was tempered now by a fragile sense of safety she hadn't felt since before her journey west. He wasn't the villain she might have expected. Not yet, at least. He offered her a piece of jerky from his pack, holding it out silently. She took it with a soft thank you, her voice husky. It was dry and tough, but sustenance. and she chewed it slowly, savoring the simple act of eating without fear or judgment. The baby slept soundly now, warmed by the fire and tucked against her body. She looked at him, this tiny life she was desperately trying to protect, and a fierce, protective instinct hardened her resolve. She would survive this, whatever this was. For him, days blurred into a rhythm dictated by travel, weather, and the need for sustenance. The stranger, whose name she learned was Caleb, he offered it without ceremony one evening while cleaning his rifle, led them through the harsh landscape with an uncanny knowledge of trails, water sources, and shelter. They slept under the stars, in shallow caves, or in abandoned, crumbling structures. Dialogue remained sparse, minimal. He spoke only when necessary, giving directions, pointing out potential dangers, offering practical advice. Eleanor learned to read his subtle cues, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, the angle of his body when he stopped to listen. She began to observe him not just as a potential threat, but as a man. He was quiet, yes, but not unfriendly. He was watchful, but not paranoid. He was capable, handling everything from tracking game to mending torn canvas with practiced ease. He never looked at her with pity or lust, only with a steady, assessing gaze that seemed to look past her circumstances to the person beneath. He shared his food, ensured she had the warmest spot by the fire, protected her from the elements and any potential dangers, seen or unseen. He asked nothing of her in return, beyond her silence and her presence. Her initial fear slowly eroded, replaced by a cautious respect, then a tentative trust. She learned to help in small ways, gathering wood, tending the fire while he hunted or scouted. She nursed her son, cared for his needs, her actions a quiet assertion of her purpose and determination. She was not just damaged goods. She was a mother, a survivor. Caleb's silent acceptance of this seemed to affirm it. He didn't judge her past, didn't question her circumstances. He simply dealt with the present reality. A woman and a child needed protection and passage. One evening, huddled around a small fire in a remote valley, a cold rain falling, she found the courage to ask the question that had burned within her since that night. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper. Why did you? Back there? In the saloon. Caleb was cleaning his knife, his movements precise. He paused, looking into the flames. His face, weathered and marked by time and hardship, was unreadable. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, broken only by the rain. Eleanor didn't press. She had learned patience, a quiet resilience. Finally, he spoke, his gaze still on the fire. "Seen it before," he said, his voice flat. "Didn't like the look of it, that was all." No grand pronouncement, no explanation of motives, simply a blunt statement of observation and reaction. He had seen cruelty, recognized it, and acted. It was a small window into the man, perhaps, but it was enough. It cemented the trust that had been slowly building. She was no longer just a burden or a rescued victim. She was someone he had chosen, for his own reasons, to protect. And in that quiet protection, she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The trust forged in silent miles and shared hardships solidified into a quiet understanding. Eleanor no longer saw Caleb solely as her rescuer or protector, but as a partner in this uncertain journey. She had shed the passive helplessness of the saloon, her resilience hardening like the sun-baked earth they traversed. She managed their camp when he was away, cared for her son with quiet competence, and found a strength in her own capabilities. Caleb, in turn, seemed to acknowledge this shift, his gaze holding a flicker of respect she hadn't seen before. Their destination, though unspoken, seemed to be away from populated areas, deeper into the wilderness. Caleb was guiding them towards a place of relative safety, a remote cabin he knew of, a place where they could perhaps weather the coming winter. The air grew colder, the landscape starker, but the hardship felt less oppressive now that she faced it with purpose and alongside someone she trusted. One afternoon, as they were making their way through a rocky pass, a sound echoed from behind them, the distinct thud of hooves on hard ground. Caleb stopped instantly, melting into the shadows of the rocks, his hand going to his pistol. He motioned for Eleanor to stay low, near a thick scrub oak, shielding her son with her body. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not despair, but the sharp, alert fear of a cornered animal protecting its young. 2 riders appeared, silhouetted against the sky at the pass entrance. They were rough-looking men, armed, their eyes scanning the trail ahead. Eleanor recognized one of them with a sickening jolt, the man who had bid $8 on her in the saloon, his face etched with greed and cruelty. They were looking for her or for Caleb or perhaps both. Caleb remained hidden, his presence a coiled tension beside her. He waited, letting the riders draw closer. As they rode past their hiding spot, heading into the pass, Caleb stepped out, gun drawn. "Hold it," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. The riders reined in their horses, startled. Their eyes widened slightly as they recognized the man who had disrupted the auction. The air crackled with tension. "We ain't lookin' for trouble," the first rider said, though his hand hovered near his gun. "You found it," Caleb replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Why are you following us?" The second rider, the one Eleanor recognized, sneered. "Heard you took something that don't belong to ya, mister. Property that was up for bid." He glanced towards Eleanor, his eyes lingering. "And maybe you got something else we want." Caleb's stance didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "She ain't property, and you ain't getting anywhere near her." The rider laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Says who? A lone gunslinger? There's 2 of us." He started to draw his weapon. Eleanor didn't think. Driven by a fierce, protective rage that surged through her veins, she grabbed a heavy rock from beside her and threw it with all her might at the second rider's horse. It hit the animal's flank, startling it. The horse reared back with a whinny, throwing the rider off balance, his shot going wide. The distraction was all Caleb needed. In a blur of motion, his gun fired twice. The first rider crumpled in his saddle and fell to the ground. The second, the one Eleanor had hit, scrambled to regain control of his horse, but Caleb's second shot was true. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder, and fell heavily. Silence descended once more, broken only by the nervous snorting of the horses and the baby's soft cries, startled by the noise. Caleb moved quickly, disarming the fallen men, checking that they were no longer a threat. He spared a glance at Eleanor, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then a slow nod. She hadn't just waited. She had acted. They left the incapacitated riders and their horses, disappearing deeper into the pass. The danger had passed, but the encounter had changed something. Eleanor felt the adrenaline fading, leaving her trembling, but also powerful. She had faced a threat and fought back. They reached the small cabin nestled in the trees as dusk settled. It was rough but sturdy, offering real shelter. Inside, Caleb built a fire in the hearth, filling the cabin with warmth and light. As the flames danced, Eleanor looked at him, then at her sleeping son. She had come west seeking a future, been cast adrift, and found herself on an auction block. Now, she was here, in a remote cabin, protected by a man whose quiet strength and unexpected kindness had pulled her from the brink. She was a jilted bride no longer, nor merely a victim. She was a survivor, a protector, standing on the threshold of an uncertain future with a quiet dignity forged in hardship. She had faced the worst and found that resilience was not the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it, to build a life piece by piece, like stones placed carefully in a wall against the coming storm. They had faced the shadows, and now, by the firelight, there was a glimmer of hope, small but persistent, like the first star appearing in the twilight sky.